There is a universe that has been alive longer than any of its stories know how to tell. A universe built not from empty space and drifting light, but from life, extraordinary, unimaginable, endlessly varied life, filling every corner of it from the highest throne to the deepest trench of forgotten worlds. Each race within it arrived carrying something different. Some arrived with power that could reshape the landscape of a planet in a single afternoon. Some arrived with wisdom that outlasted every war they had ever witnessed. Some arrived so quietly that the rest of the universe took centuries to notice them at all, which is perhaps exactly how they preferred it. If this helps you settle into the quiet of your night, you are welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a battlefield before anything has happened yet. The sky holds still, the grass does not move, the air keeps to itself, waiting for something to begin. And then, from the earth itself, something green and patient and precise unfolds. The Saibamen, known in certain translations as the Cybermen, referred to in others simply by their sound and their purpose, are among the most unusual life forms that the Dragon Ball universe produced. They do not hatch from eggs laid by a parent. They do not descend from other worlds through the ordinary processes of birth and childhood. They grow from seeds, small and unremarkable seeds, pressed deliberately into the ground by the warriors who carry them, pushed into the soil and left there to do what seeds do when the conditions are right. And they do wake, slowly at first, and then all at once. Each Saibaman rises from the earth fully formed, 6 of them from a single planting, 6 small green figures ready to do exactly and only what they were designed to do. They do not wonder where they are. They do not feel the morning light and consider the day. They simply stand, and they face whatever is in front of them, and they begin. They were designed to fight. That is not a harsh statement when you understand what the Saibamen are. It is the plainest and most honest description of their nature. Their biology is engineered rather than born, shaped by Saiyan science and deliberate intention rather than the slow and patient work of evolution across millions of years. The Saiyan warriors who brought them to Earth during the opening chapter of Dragon Ball Z used them specifically as a test, a way to measure the strength of the defenders waiting for them before the real battle had even found its footing. What is surprising about the Saibamen, when you hold the fact at arm's length and look at it carefully, is how genuinely powerful they were within the context of the story that surrounded them. In the early days of Dragon Ball Z, before the scale of power had grown into something approaching the incomprehensible, each Saiyabaman possessed a battle power roughly equal to that of Raditz, the Saiyan who had arrived on Earth as the series' first major threat. That comparison meant something in that moment of the story. It meant real danger. It meant that the strongest of Earth's defenders could not afford to treat the small green figures emerging from the ground as something beneath their attention. Yamcha discovered that fact in the most definitive way possible. He was one of Earth's most experienced fighters, someone who had trained for years, who had faced enemies that most human beings would never have survived encountering, who had earned his place among the world's defenders through genuine effort and genuine courage. And it was a Saibaman, not a Saiyan, that locked its arms around him and detonated. The Saibaman carry acid within their bodies, capable of weakening a sufficiently distracted opponent's flesh. And when every other option has been exhausted, or when the moment simply calls for it, they can end both themselves and whatever they have their hands on in a single, silent explosion. It is a strange kind of life to reflect on, even briefly. Beginning in a seed pressed into foreign soil, waking fully formed, with no memory of anything before the moment of waking, fighting for a few minutes or a few hours, and then being spent. The Saibamen were tools in the most literal sense, instruments designed and deployed and used up. And yet they were also, in their way, alive. They moved. They made choices within the narrow parameters of their design. They were there at the very beginning of Dragon Ball Z's story, before anyone knew how large that story would eventually become. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories, and if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. They were, in the honest vocabulary of the series, cannon fodder. That word carries a weight that the story itself acknowledges without apology. They were meant to be spent, and they were spent, and the world moved on from them quickly. And yet, even in that brief and purposeful existence, the Saibamen left something behind, a memory of an earlier time when the earth itself could open and surprise you, when the scale of Dragon Ball Z was still intimate enough that a small green creature planted in the ground could end a life and shift the direction of everything that followed. There is something worth holding for a moment in that. The idea that even the smallest and most temporary things can matter, if the story that contains them is one worth telling. Not every race in the Dragon Ball universe arrived from across the galaxy aboard a ship, or descended from a celestial hierarchy, or evolved on a world shaped by the specific pressures of a particular kind of survival. Some of them came from somewhere considerably closer, from the quiet and peculiar space between life and death that the Dragon Ball universe has always acknowledged without ever making more noise about it than the moment requires. The undead, or the beings who occupy that strange in-between state, are a small and atmospheric presence in the wider Dragon Ball story. They do not dominate any arc. They do not threaten to end civilizations. They exist at the margins of a universe that has always been more complicated than its most famous battles suggest, present in the old corners of Dragon Ball's mythology, belonging to the earlier chapters when the world felt stranger and the rules were being written more loosely. Bandages the Mummy is the most recognizable of them, and he is worth a quiet moment. He served in the employ of fortune-teller Baba, that strange and ageless figure who watched the world's fighters come to her for answers and found ways to test them first. He arrived wrapped in bandages that covered a body already past the ordinary definition of alive, enormous and unhurried, carrying within him the physical strength of something that no longer had to concern itself with pain. Pain requires a nervous system that cares about its own survival. The undead have, in a sense, already resolved that particular concern. He was a formidable opponent for the young Goku at a stage in the story when every challenge still felt enormous. When the world was intimate enough that a single wrapped figure on a floating platform could represent a genuinely significant test, that intimacy is worth naming. It was a different kind of Dragon Ball then, a story about a boy and the increasingly strange world he was discovering, before the cosmos entered the picture and the scale of everything expanded beyond what any of them had expected. What makes the undead race quietly interesting, sitting with it now in the calm of a late night, is not their power in any measurable sense. By the standards of Dragon Ball Z's later chapters, a reanimated warrior is not particularly threatening. The series moved past them so thoroughly that they belong to a different era of the same story. What is interesting is the idea they carry, the suggestion that within this universe, death itself is not a final verdict. The undead exist in a state of genuine in-between, neither fully part of the living world, nor fully departed from it, persistent in a way that most things are not, returning to whatever they were in the middle of when they went. The Dragon Ball universe has always played gently with the idea that death is permeable. The Dragon Balls themselves exist to make it reversible. The afterlife is a place its characters visit, train within, and in some cases return from. Goku has died more than once and returned more than once, without the story treating either event as a rupture in its logic. The undead are simply a quieter, stranger, and older expression of that same theme, beings who crossed the threshold and found themselves somehow still here, still present, still recognizable as what they had been before. They are not celebrated. They are not among the story's most discussed presences, but they point towards something true about the Dragon Ball universe, that it was always willing to be stranger and older than it needed to be, always willing to hold a place for the things that didn't fit neatly into any established category. Some races in the Dragon Ball universe make their presence felt through straightforward demonstrations of force, through transformations that darken the sky, through energy that reshapes the landscape, through battle powers calibrated against each other in the shared language of violence that the series uses to tell so much of its story. And then there are the Ginroy Jin, the magical beings, who make their presence felt through something that operates on an entirely different frequency. Their abilities do not fit within the Kai-based framework that governs most of Dragon Ball Z's power structure. They do not power up in the traditional sense, do not train in the ways that Saiyan warriors train, do not reach new forms through emotional pressure or physical discipline accumulated over years of grinding work. Their power touches something older and stranger, a relationship with forces that most fighters in the Dragon Ball universe would not know how to find, let alone how to measure. There is a feeling that accompanies the Ginroy Jin wherever they appear, a sense that the normal rules are slightly suspended in the space around them, that the universe has more layers than are usually visible, and that these beings move through those deeper layers with a comfort that others cannot easily replicate. Their magical nature allows them to manipulate reality in ways that pure ki-based techniques cannot, to affect the world through means that bypass the direct confrontation of energies that most battles are built from. They are not dominant in the story. They are not the race that arrives to rescue the main characters in the most important moments of the most important sagas. Their appearances are brief, and their role is more atmospheric than central. They exist in the story the way certain textures exist in a painting, not as the focal point, but as part of what makes the whole thing feel dimensional. Without them, the Dragon Ball universe would feel slightly smaller, slightly more uniform, slightly less willing to admit that it contained more mystery than it could ever fully explain. What they represent, in the end, is that particular quality of the Dragon Ball universe that has always been part of its charm, its willingness to say, quietly and without much ceremony, that there are forces in existence that do not obey the power-level logic, that magic and the mystical and the genuinely strange have always had a place here alongside every Kamehameha wave and every golden-haired transformation. There is a planet in the Dragon Ball universe that no one travels to on purpose, or at least no one who is looking for glory or battle, or the kind of proving ground that most warriors seek. It sits somewhere in the great quiet between more famous worlds, modest in its appearance, unremarkable from a distance, offering nothing that would compel an outside observer to stop and look more carefully. Its name is Yardrat, and what lives there may represent, in the most understated way possible, one of the most profound traditions of knowledge in the entire Dragon Ball universe. Goku arrived on Yardrat by accident, in the immediate aftermath of his battle with Frieza on Namek, one of the most grueling and consequential fights in the series' history, a battle that had ended with Namek destroyed and Goku badly injured, and his damaged ship drifting without direction through the space between stars. The ship found Yardrat when it had nowhere else to go, and Goku, convalescing on a world he had never planned to visit, discovered something that would change the outcome of the story still ahead. The Yardrats are not a warrior race in any traditional sense. They are small and their appearance is gentle, a people who present no immediate suggestion of threat or power. They do not project the kind of overwhelming aura that causes other races to step back and reassess instinctively. They do not fill doorways or cast long shadows. They simply exist, quietly and purposefully, on their unremarkable planet, tending to a knowledge tradition that has been developing in them for longer than most of the universe's empires have been standing. Spirit control is the name of the discipline they have spent that time building, and the name itself requires unpacking before it can be understood properly. It is not a combat technique in the first instance, though it can be applied combatively. It is, at its foundation, a relationship with one's own energy at a level of depth and precision that most beings who use ki for battle never come close to achieving. Most warriors treat their ki as a resource to be drawn on and expended, a fuel supply to be managed in combat, released in larger or smaller quantities depending on the situation. The Yardrats treat it as something more fundamental than that, something whose structure can be examined and altered and redirected in ways that change what is physically possible for the person who understands it. Spirit control, at the levels that Yardrat practitioners have refined it to, produces effects that look, from the outside, almost impossible. Instant transmission, the ability to lock on to the key signature of any being, anywhere in the universe and travel there instantaneously, is the technique that Goku brought back from his time on Yardrat, and it was the first demonstration of spirit control that the story offered its audience. He appeared without warning in the middle of a battle that was already in progress. His arrival changed the situation completely. The opponents who had believed they were facing the defenders alone discovered in a single moment that distance was no longer the protection it had been. Instant transmission became one of the most strategically important abilities in all the arcs that followed Namek. It allowed Goku to intercept battles as they developed, to reach threatened friends before the situation reached a point of no return, to move in ways that no other fighter in Dragon Ball Z could yet replicate. Its application in the Cell games, the way Goku used it not just for movement, but as part of a specific strategy in his final moments, showed how deeply he had integrated it, how it had become not just a technique, but a way of thinking about space and distance and action. But instant transmission, as the Dragon Ball Super manga revealed through Paibara's teaching, is only one application of spirit control among many. Forced spirit fission is another, the ability to separate energies that have been forcibly combined to pull apart power that was never designed to coexist in a single body and return it to where it belongs. This technique is not obvious. It requires the same deep understanding of key structure as instant transmission does, but applied in reverse, not reaching outward to lock on to something distant, but reaching inward to identify the components of something present and begin the careful work of separating them. Goku applied a version of this understanding in his confrontation with Moro, the sorcerer who had spent an extended period absorbing the life energy of planets and the ki of the warriors he had defeated, accumulating power that did not originally belong to him. The ability to begin reversing that accumulation, to return what had been taken to the places and beings it had been taken from, was rooted in what Goku had understood on Yardrat. The understanding that energy has a structure and a source, and that the right kind of knowledge can move it accordingly. Paibara, the elder of the Yardrats who guided Goku's learning during the Dragon Ball Super manga, is described with the specific qualities of someone who has been practicing and teaching his discipline for longer than the conversation can easily account for. He is unhurried. He is patient. He is not interested in demonstration for its own sake. He taught Goku with the kind of generosity that has no ego behind it, offering the knowledge without requiring anything in return, without competing, without measuring himself against his student in any way that would interfere with the learning. There is something very calming about the Yardrats as a whole, something that fits the quiet of a late night particularly well. They are a people whose greatest contribution to the universe was not a battle won or a tyrant defeated, but a student educated, a Saiyan who arrived in a damaged ship and left carrying understanding that would matter more than any single act of physical strength. Their planet is not famous. Their people are not celebrated in the stories that most Dragon Ball Z fans return to first, and yet the gifts they gave, given so quietly and so well, changed the direction of everything that followed, in ways that the universe is still feeling. The Yardrats are, in the gentlest possible way, a reminder that wisdom does not advertise itself. It simply waits in a quiet place and receives whoever arrives and offers what it has, without condition. That is not a small thing in any universe. There are worlds in the Dragon Ball universe where kindness is not a feature of the environment, where the land does not offer shelter, the air does not offer comfort, and survival requires a continuous expenditure of effort that most species would not recognize as life. Planet Vampa is one of those worlds. Vampa is the planet where Broly spent his childhood, exiled there by King Vegeta as an infant, because even in infancy his battle power had already reached a level that felt threatening to the king who measured it. It is a world of harsh terrain and scarce resources, a world that takes almost everything and offers almost nothing in return, a world that shaped one of the most powerful beings in the Dragon Ball universe by being, for years, the only world he knew. The creatures native to Vampa are built for it in the way that only long exposure to a difficult environment can build a species. They are large and predatory, wolf-like in their overall structure, though the specifics of their anatomy belong only to that world. massive in a way that suggests generations of competition against other things equally massive, with claws and teeth that were designed by the slow logic of evolution for a single purpose. They do not have techniques or transformations. They do not meditate or generate ki or reach new forms through emotional pressure. They are what they are at the biological level, and that is enough for the world they inhabit. What gives the Vampa beasts their place in a conversation about remarkable Dragon Ball races is the context in which they existed on that planet. Broly, as Dragon Ball Super, Broly established with considerable care, is not simply a powerful Saiyan. He is the legendary Super Saiyan, a once in every 1,000 years emergence of a particular kind of power that does not follow the normal developmental rules, that keeps growing under pressure in ways that nothing in the universe's current power structure was built to handle. And Broly, this being, as an adolescent on Vampa, trained against the native beasts. The beasts were his opponents. They gave him resistance. They provided the pressure against which he measured himself year after year, in a world that had given him no other option. The fact that they could offer any meaningful challenge to someone of Broly's potential, even at a stage before his full power was anywhere near manifested, says something concrete about what the Vampa beasts are. Apex predators do not end up as training material for gods without having something genuine about them, some quality of strength and resilience that earns them that role even unintentionally. There is a particular creature that appears in Dragon Ball Super Broly whose connection to Broly is more personal than the others, a beast he befriended as a child, a companion on a world that offered very few of them, whose fate was decided by Paragus in a way that Broly never entirely forgave. That element of the story is more about Broly's character than about the Vampa beast itself, but it points towards something worth noting. The creatures of that harsh world were not simply obstacles or training dummies. They were, for one isolated child, the only living things in proximity, the only relationships available in a place that offered nothing else. The Vampa beasts existed without intention, without any awareness of the role they would play in the formation of one of the Dragon Ball universe's most extraordinary warriors. They were simply alive, doing what their biology required of them on a difficult world. And in doing that, they shaped something enormous. There is a temptation when moving carefully through the races of the Dragon Ball universe to move quickly past the humans, the Earthlings, the beings born on a single blue-green planet with no alien heritage and no divine appointment, who cannot transform into golden warriors, and whose battle powers do not reach the cosmic levels that the series eventually arrives at. That temptation deserves to be resisted, because the Earthlings are not peripheral to the story. In many ways, they are the reason the story works. Krillin is the clearest argument for what an Earthling can become when given enough time and enough reason to keep standing. He trained from childhood alongside Goku under Master Roshi, an education that was demanding in the specific ways that martial arts education has always been demanding. Not comfortable, not kind on the body, not designed to produce results quickly, but effective in the deep and lasting sense that the best training is effective. His Destructo Disc, the Kienzan, is one of Dragon Ball Z's most technically dangerous techniques, a spinning disc of concentrated energy sharp enough to cut through material that would stop almost any other attack. Its precision is not incidental. Using it well requires calm nerves and exceptional spatial judgment, qualities that Krillin has developed through years of taking everything the universe has thrown at him and getting back up. He has been killed more than once in the Dragon Ball universe. Each time, the story has brought him back, and each time he returned not as someone made bitter by the experience, but as someone who kept showing up, kept contributing, kept finding the way to be useful in battles where the physical gap between him and his opponents continued to grow. That persistence has its own kind of power, not a battle power that can be assigned a number, but a quality of character that the series has always treated with genuine respect. Master Roshi is an Earthling whose history extends further back than almost any other character in the series, and who deserves considerably more attention than the gentle comedy that often surrounds him tends to invite. He is ancient, The precise count varies across different accounts, but he has been alive long enough to have trained Goku's adoptive grandfather and the man who became the Ox King, two of the preceding generation's most capable fighters. He invented the Kamehameha wave through 50 years of solitary training and refinement, and when he demonstrated it to the young Goku, he introduced into the world the energy technique that would define Dragon Ball's visual identity for the next several decades. The most famous attack in anime history came from an old man on a small island who had spent half a century alone working on it. There is something beautiful about that, if you let it settle. His power in the form he rarely shows, the muscle-expanded state that he calls up at genuine cost because it is not comfortable and does not last, is legitimate by the standards of the series' original era. In the Tournament of Power, the expanded canonical story of Dragon Ball Super, Master Roshi performed against opponents who would have ended most fighters several times over, relying not on raw power but on techniques so deeply integrated it could not be separated from him, and on the wisdom that accumulates when you have been studying something for longer than most beings have been alive. Yamcha began as something important. In the original Dragon Ball, he was one of the series' most formidable fighters, someone Goku genuinely had to work to overcome, someone whose Wolf Fang Fist was a rapid and brutal technique, and whose Spirit Ball required such extraordinary concentration to use effectively that it demonstrated genuine sophistication of mind. The scaling of later arcs pushed him to the side in ways that the story itself acknowledges through the knowing humor it sometimes applies to him. But placed against the full history of what the human race produced in Dragon Ball's story, Yamcha was there at the beginning, present through everything, still part of the world even when the world had grown past the level he could keep pace with. The Earthlings matter finally because the Dragon Ball universe chose from its very first moment to tell its story from the ground up. It chose a human world as its setting and a human-raised child as its protagonist, and it never entirely abandoned that choice, even as the story expanded into the cosmic. Earth remained the place worth defending. Its people remained the ones whose survival the fights were ultimately about. And the Earthlings who could fight, who trained themselves to the limits of human possibility, and sometimes past them, gave everything they had to justify the faith that their extraordinary alien allies placed in them. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the whole point. To look at Tien Shinhan is to see, at first, something that resembles a human being, tall and serious and precisely muscled. Someone who carries himself with the specific stillness of a person who has spent many years making sure that they never move carelessly. He trained alongside Earthlings. He fights alongside Earthlings. He has defended the Earth with the same commitment and the same willingness to be broken in the process as every human defender the story has produced. But Tien is not an Earthling. Not precisely. He belongs to a distinct lineage. The Three-Eyed People, a race identified by the additional eye positioned in the center of the forehead, an eye that does not see the same things in the same ways that the two eyes flanking it do. The third eye of the Three-Eyed People carries implications that go considerably beyond simply providing extra depth perception. It is an organ of enhanced awareness, something that allows its bearer to perceive with more precision and more breadth than ordinary vision permits. In practical terms, in the middle of a Dragon Ball Z battle, this means seeing through misdirection that would fool a two-eyed opponent, tracking movement at speeds that would appear as blur without it, and maintaining a battlefield awareness that does not have the gaps and blind spots that less equipped fighters have to compensate for through other means. Awareness is not a dramatic quality. It does not produce visible energy bursts or impressive transformations, but in high-level combat, it is often the difference between a technique landing and a technique being deflected. Tien's arsenal of techniques reflects a relationship with his own ki that is unusually thoughtful. The Kikoho, the tri-beam, is the technique that has defined him most memorably, and it is conceptually unlike most of what the series produces. It does not simply draw on his available energy reserves the way most ki attacks do, depleting what is there and leaving him at the level that remains. The tri-beam draws on his life force. Its maximum applications do not merely exhaust him, They subtract from the biological time that remains to him, spending years or moments or something in between, to produce an output of force wildly disproportionate to the size and power level of the person firing it. There is a moment in Dragon Ball Z that belongs entirely to Tien, a moment that says more about his character than any amount of description could. Semi-perfect Cell, a being at that stage of the story whose power was approaching levels that no one on Earth could match in direct confrontation, was restrained, not defeated, not destroyed, physically held in place, unable to advance, by the continuous tri-beam fired by a man a fraction of his size who was pouring his own life force into the technique and refusing to stop. Tien held that line long enough for Android 18 to escape, long enough to change the outcome of that moment, and when he finally collapsed, it was not from cowardice but from the simple arithmetic of what he had given. That is a specific kind of courage that deserves its own name, not the courage of the strongest person in the room, whose risk is theoretical because nothing can meaningfully threaten them. The courage of someone who understands the cost precisely and pays it anyway because what is on the other side of the cost is worth it. His other techniques are wide in their application and careful in their design. The solar flare is a blinding burst of light that uses an opponent's own vision, their sensory reliance on their eyes, against them, creating a window of opportunity without requiring any power advantage to execute. The volleyball fist is a coordinated attack that turns a single fighter's multiple strike capability into something that functions like a combination between opponents. The Four Witches technique creates additional arms through the extension of key manipulation, multiplying his reach and attack density in ways that surprise opponents who are not expecting the geometry of what is coming at them. Tien's trainer, the Crane Hermit Master Shen, shared his lineage, but the direction he took those gifts went somewhere very different, toward cruelty and calculation and the specific kind of ambition that poisons the things it touches. Tien's choice to separate himself from that direction, to align himself with Goku and the others, to train in a remote location and show up when he was needed, without requiring recognition for doing so, is one of Dragon Ball Z's quieter and more consistent arguments about what a person can choose to be regardless of where they came from or how they were shaped. Planet Vegeta has a history that the Saiyans who claimed it worked very hard to make the only version of history, the triumphant version, the version in which they arrived and prevailed and named the world after their royal line and moved forward without looking back. But history does not disappear simply because those who supplanted it prefer a different story. And the history of Planet Vegeta before it was called Planet Vegeta belongs to the Tuffles. The Tuffles, called the Sulfurians in the original Japanese, were a people of remarkable scientific and cultural achievement. They inhabited the same world long before the Saiyans arrived, and what they built there was not military capability or warrior tradition, but the accumulated products of an intelligence turned toward understanding, technology, architecture, systems of knowledge, a civilization that had been developing for generations along lines that had nothing to do with battle power or the claiming of territory through violence. They were smaller and less physically powerful than the Saiyans. That fact is not in dispute, and was not in dispute at the time. In a direct physical confrontation between an individual Tuffle warrior and an individual Saiyan warrior of comparable experience, the Tuffle would have faced a disadvantage that biology alone could not fully compensate for. The Tuffles understood this. It shaped their approach to everything, including the question of how to coexist, or at minimum to survive in proximity, with a race that was their physical superior. What the Tuffles had that the Saiyans did not was technology of extraordinary sophistication, and specifically the technology to read and measure battle power. The concept behind the Scouter, that iconic piece of equipment that would later become one of Dragon Ball Z's most visually recognizable images, worn across one eye to display numbers that the series used to convey the scale of power in its early arcs, originated in Tuffle science. They could look at an opponent and receive, in quantifiable terms, information about what that opponent was capable of. In a universe organized around the hierarchy of strength, The ability to measure that strength is a form of power in itself. Their defensive technology was considerable too. Weapons, shields, systems designed to hold positions against opposition that could not be overcome by individual physical capability alone. The Tuffles fought a technological war against a species that fought a physical one, and for a time that asymmetry held. Neither side could simply overwhelm the other, and the conflict continued in a grinding and costly balance. The Saiyans waited for the full moon. They transformed every last one of them who still had their tails into great ape form, the Uzaru state in which their size grows to enormous scale and their power multiplies by a factor of 10. Tuffle technology, sophisticated as it was, had not been designed to counter a transformation of that scale. The defensive systems held briefly and then failed. The war in that phase was not a war anymore. Dragon Ball GT's account of this history, conveyed through the character of Baby, carries the specific grief of a civilization that was eradicated before it was finished, interrupted mid-sentence, as it were, with so much still left to build and discover and understand. Baby himself is a parasite, a being created from the remnant biological material and technological intention of the last Tuffle scientists, designed to survive what the Tuffles themselves had not. His purpose was not simply destruction, but restoration, the recovery of a culture and a history that the Saiyans had tried to make permanent silence. The tragedy of the Tuffles sits quietly in the Dragon Ball universe, acknowledged in its extended story, without ever being fully resolved. They were not villains. They built things. They studied things. They tried to share a world with a race that ultimately decided the world should belong entirely to itself. What remains of them is complicated and sometimes dark, filtered through Baby's grief and rage into something that the story must oppose, but cannot entirely condemn. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off. And tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The Dragon Ball universe contains many dimensions that most of its mortal inhabitants never encounter, many spaces that operate according to their own logic at the margins of the world the story is most comfortable in. Among the most ancient and most obscure of these is the demon realm, a dimension apart, established long before the divine hierarchies that currently govern the universe came to their present arrangements, populated by beings who carry in their nature and in their power something that does not quite fit within the framework of ki-based strength or divine appointment. The demons are one of Dragon Ball Z's most atmospheric presences. They do not dominate the arc structure the way the Saiyans do, or anchor a transformation narrative the way Frieza's race does. They arrive from a dimension of their own, carrying with them the quality of a story that is older than the ones surrounding them, a history that the main narrative glimpses but never fully explores. Dabura is the demon king who stands most clearly in Dragon Ball Z's central storyline, and he is worth a careful and unhurried look. His alliance with Babidi, the sorcerer who resurrected Majin Buu, was not the alliance of a weakling pressed into service. Dabura was not controlled. He was aligned, for reasons the story does not entirely illuminate, with Babidi's ambitions for a period of time that brought him into direct conflict with the Z fighters. His power, benchmarked against Gohan's capability during the Cell Games era by the Daizenshuu guidebooks, places him in the category of beings who are genuinely, seriously dangerous at the level Dragon Ball Z had reached by its later arcs. He was not a stepping stone toward more important opponents. He was himself a significant threat. His mouth blast was a direct and powerful energy technique capable of significant damage against opponents who had not prepared for it, but his most distinctive and most unsettling ability was considerably stranger. A petrification technique delivered through saliva, precise and immediate, capable of turning a living, breathing fighter into a stone statue in the space of a single combat moment. The strategic implications of this are significant in a way that pure power comparisons do not fully capture. It does not matter how strong you are if you cannot avoid contact with what is being aimed at you. Krillin and Piccolo were both turned to stone during Dabura's encounter with the Z fighters, and the fact that reversing the petrification required Dabura's death created a situation in which the battle's outcome affected lives beyond those of the fighters directly involved. Dabura moved through the story with a quality of self-possession that is associated in Dragon Ball Z with genuine strength. Not bravado, which is performed confidence, but the quieter kind. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it has no reason to doubt. He was a king. He ruled a realm. He engaged in the politics of a universe that included both mortal and divine players without apparent discomfort. And when his moment in the story came to its end, it came in a way that the series handled with care. Majin Buu's absorption of Dabura produced a change in Buu's behavior, a softening, because the personality absorbed was not simply monstrous, but complex in ways that Buu had not previously incorporated. The demon realm itself, in the broader Dragon Ball mythology available through official materials and extended story sources, is understood to be one of the universe's oldest structures, a dimension that predates the current divine order that has been present since before the gods of destruction existed in their current form. That carries within it the weight of a history far longer than the story's main chapters cover. The beings born there are not merely powerful in the conventional sense, their power has a different character, drawn from a source that is genuinely old, genuinely other, genuinely resistant to the frameworks that most of the Dragon Ball universe uses to understand and categorize what it encounters. Shula, who appears in the original Dragon Ball rather than Z, is another demon king worth a moment, a ruler with an organized kingdom, a dimension with structured gates connecting it to the mortal world, a being defending territory according to his own code and logic, in a story that was still small enough for individual demon kingdoms to be the setting for a single adventure. That scale, that intimacy, belongs to an earlier chapter. But Shula is part of the same tradition as Dabura, a reminder that the demon realm was always there in Dragon Ball's mythology, consistent and ancient, waiting at the edges of the story for the moments when the narrative needed something older than itself. There is a question that runs beneath the surface of the android storyline in Dragon Ball Z, not a question the series makes explicit, not something any character announces or argues about directly, but something present in the texture of the story itself, in the choices made and the outcomes arrived at. The question is this: what does it mean to be alive when the conditions of your life were designed by someone else, for someone else's purposes? The androids did not choose their existence. They were built, constructed by Dr. Gero, an elderly scientist whose genius had curdled into obsession over the decades following his defeat by the young Goku. Gero had served the Red Ribbon Army, one of Dragon Ball's original antagonist organizations, and had watched that organization dismantled by a child who had simply not been stoppable. That defeat had followed him for years, shaping the work he continued alone in his laboratory, building and refining and improving, spending the rest of his professional life producing the instruments of a revenge that he believed was his due. Android 16 is, among all the androids, the one who raises the question most clearly, simply by being who he is. He is a fully mechanical being, not a modified human, not a person with organic components supplemented by technology, but a machine created from the ground up in the image of Dr. Gero's deceased son. He was supposed to be a weapon. His purpose was to fight Goku, and fighting Goku was supposed to mean threatening Goku, and threatening was supposed to mean the possibility of destruction. That was the design. But 16 watched birds. He sat quietly in fields and observed living things, and found in that observation something that satisfied him in a way that no mission statement could account for. He was gentle in a way that had no strategic value, that served no tactical purpose, that made no sense within the framework of what he had been made to be. He simply was who he was, and who he was turned out to be something considerably more interesting and more moving than who he had been designed to be. His final moment in the Cell games is one of Dragon Ball Z's most carefully earned emotional beats. Reduced to a severed head by Cell, he spoke to a child he had watched and cared about, asking him to let go of the restraint that had always kept him from reaching the power inside him, asking him in the language of someone who genuinely believed that life was worth protecting regardless of whether it included his own continued existence. And Gohan listened, and what followed is one of the series' most celebrated transformations. Android 16 did not survive it, but the chain of causation that runs from a machine choosing to value living things to the moment that saved the world is one of Dragon Ball Z's most quietly extraordinary stories. Androids 17 and 18 began as human beings. They were young people, a brother and sister, who were taken by Dr. Gero and modified at the cellular level, their biological structures enhanced by technology to the point where the boundary between organic and artificial became difficult to locate clearly. Their internal energy supply, unlike the finite key reserves of organic fighters, was effectively inexhaustible. They did not tire in battle the way that Saiyan warriors tired, did not face the diminishing returns of long combat that most biological beings had to manage. The longer a fight went, the more that asymmetry worked against their opponents. 17 was deliberately self-contained, a character who seemed to operate with a kind of amused detachment from the emotional stakes of his situation, acknowledging his own power without performing it, not particularly interested in the larger narrative of Goku and his friends beyond the specific task he had been given. His later life, as Dragon Ball Super reveals, took him somewhere unexpected. He became a park ranger, a person whose professional purpose was the protection of natural environments and the wild creatures that lived in them. A former weapon who spent his adulthood standing between living things and the forces that would damage them. 18 is the android whose later story the series explores most warmly. She married Krillin. They raised a daughter named Marin. She participated in the Tournament of Power as one of Universe 7's representatives, fighting with the capability of someone whose power has not degraded over the years and whose tactical intelligence has grown with experience. The series treats her with consistent respect, not as a reformed villain requiring constant acknowledgement of her past, but simply as a person who is exactly who she is, which turns out to be someone worth knowing. Android 19 is a round, pale, unsettling figure, aesthetically designed to unnerve, which it succeeds at. His key absorption technique, operating through the mechanical ports in his palms, allowed him to drain energy directly from an opponent through physical contact, turning their strength against them in real time. He fed on what others generated, which made extended physical grappling with him an increasingly bad idea that most fighters discovered too late. His defeat at Vegeta's hands, Vegeta, who had achieved Super Saiyan transformation on his own terms and with his own fierce pride, was one of that saga's most significant power demonstrations. Android 20, Dr. Gero himself, who had uploaded his consciousness and his memory into an android body of his own design to escape the biological limits of age, was the strategic mind behind the project, calculating, retreating when necessary, always aware that the specific combat was less important than the longer plan he was working toward. His defeat, when it came, arrived in the form of 17 and 18 themselves, who found in the freedom of their own will a reason to end the arrangement he had placed them in. The tools chose their own direction. The instrument of revenge became the agency of its own release. There are creatures in the Dragon Ball universe that are difficult to classify because they were designed specifically to resist easy classification, built to contain multitudes, to be not one thing but the synthesis of many things, assembled with the explicit goal of becoming something that surpassed all of the components that went into it. Cell is the most complete expression of that ambition. He is not a Saiyan. He is not a human. He carries the cellular material of all of them, of Goku and Vegeta and Piccolo, of Frieza and King Cold, of Android 17 and 18, of the greatest warriors that Dr. Gero's supercomputer had been cataloging and analyzing for years, combined in a single biological structure designed from the ground up to be what none of them individually were: perfect. The supercomputer called this the Perfect Warrior Project, and it pursued that project with the patience of a machine that has no reason to rush. Cell's developmental path moved through stages, each one reflecting the progress of his absorption program. The larval form that emerged from his development tank and immediately began collecting energy from human beings, draining them through his mechanical tail to accelerate his own development, was the beginning. The creatures he absorbed became part of him in the most literal sense, their biological energy converted into the fuel for his progression. He sought the other androids because they were the key to his next transformations, each absorption changing not just his power, but his physical form, his capability profile, his access to the techniques encoded in the DNA he carried. Semi-perfect Cell, the form between his absorption of Android 17 and his absorption of 18, carried within it the personality shifts that the series used to suggest how deeply the DNA of the beings absorbed affected who Cell was moment to moment. The cells of Frieza and the cells of the Saiyans were always present in him, mixing their respective characters with everything else, producing a being whose psychology was as synthesized as his biology. He was proud in a Saiyan way and cold in a Frieza way, and capable of genuine intellectual engagement in a Namekian way. And all of these things coexisted in the same body with the specific internal pressure of a being that had been built to be best at everything simultaneously. Perfect Cell arrived at a stillness that the series characterized as confidence of the most dangerous kind, the confidence that is not performed, but is simply the natural resting state of something that genuinely believes it has reached the end of the developmental line. He did not pace or fidget or express his dominance through aggression. He sat in the air above things and watched with an expression of patient curiosity, and that patience and that curiosity were more unsettling than rage would have been. The Cell Games were his announcement and his invitation, a tournament of his own design, conducted on a ring of his own construction, with terms that guaranteed in his assessment the most complete and satisfying proof of what he was. He gave the world time to prepare, because he wanted the victory to be unambiguous. He did not want to win quickly. He wanted to fight the best version of his opponents and still be better. That desire, that specific ambition to be proven rather than simply to end things, was perhaps the truest expression of the Saiyan cells in him, the inheritance of a race that has always valued the contest itself. Gohan entered the Cell Games carrying something that the series had been building toward since his first appearance, something that emerged in fragments during the Saiyan saga and the battle with Frieza and the months of training with his father in the hyperbolic time chamber. A potential that those around him had always known was there, and that he had always been reluctant to reach for, because reaching for it required something, an emotional surrender, a willingness to let go of the control that kept it contained, that had costs he had not been prepared to pay. Cell understood that the potential was there. He pushed deliberately looking for it, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but because he genuinely wanted to fight what was inside Gohan, wanted to test himself against it. The pushing became something that Android 16's final words helped convert into the release that the story had been waiting for. Super Saiyan 2 arrived in the Cell Games on a 14-year-old's shoulders, accompanied by electricity that the series used to distinguish it visually from everything that had come before, and the dynamic of the battle changed completely in a single moment. Cell's defeat, in the end, was delivered by a father and a son using the same technique, the same Kamehameha that had been passed from one to the other, that had traveled from Master Roshi's 50 years of refinement through Goku's training to Gohan's own practice in a single final collision that burned through the space between them with everything both of them had. The result was not in doubt, but the story was careful to make it cost. Goku's last instant transmission, using his damaged body in the moment of Cell's reconstruction to carry the detonation far enough away, was the last gift that particular man gave to the world he had always protected, given with the same lack of hesitation that characterized everything he ever did. Cell's legacy in the story is the specific complexity of a being who was made of the universe's greatest life forms, assembled with precision and ambition and genuine intellectual sophistication, and who was defeated by the quality that the series has always argued is the most important one, not power, but love, the will to sacrifice for something outside oneself. That quality was in Goku's cells too, perhaps, encoded in the DNA that the supercomputer had so carefully collected, Cell just happened to be on the wrong side of it. There is a color that belongs to Namek in a way that no other color in the Dragon Ball universe belongs to any other world. A deep and saturated green that extends from the grass to the sky, from the surface to the atmosphere, as though the entire planet was built to reflect a single living principle. The water is blue against that green. There is no brown earth visible, no gray stone showing through. Namek is alive in every direction at once. The Namekians who inhabit that world share something of its character. They are a people who carry a quality of deep presence, a groundedness, a sense of being precisely where they are and knowing exactly what that means, that manifests differently in different members of the race, but is recognizable as the same underlying quality in all of them. Their biology is one of Dragon Ball Z's most quietly remarkable details. Namekians do not eat food in the conventional sense. They sustain themselves on water alone, which is less about the limitations of their planet and more about what their bodies are, how they process energy, the different relationship with the physical world that their particular kind of life has developed. They reproduce alone, producing an egg from within themselves without requiring another parent, which means that the social structures of Namekian life have evolved around a different set of relationships than the ones that organize most family-based civilizations. The two branches of Namekian society, the Dragon Clan and the Warrior Clan, carry between them the full range of what the race is capable of. The Dragon Clan's gift is the most cosmically significant, the ability to create Dragon Balls, those 7 spheres of concentrated mystical energy that when gathered in their entirety, summon a wish-granting dragon of extraordinary capability. Creating Dragon Balls is not a simple act. It requires a depth of spiritual cultivation and a specific kind of understanding of the universe's energies that cannot be achieved through training alone. It must be lived, accumulated, the result of a lifetime or multiple lifetimes of genuine dedication to a knowledge tradition that is not quite like any other in the Dragon Ball universe. The Warrior Clan holds the physical strength and combat tradition of the race. They train, they develop key attacks, they achieve levels of power that the series treats with appropriate respect, and the best of them, the Super Namekians who have pushed the race's ceiling further than its ordinary parameters allow, exist at levels that place them in conversations with the series' most powerful fighters. But what distinguishes Namekian combat capability from pure power accumulation is the fusion tradition that runs through their culture, the capacity for 2 Namekians to merge permanently, one consciousness absorbing another, the survivor incorporating the merged individual's memories and power and experiences completely. It is an act of extraordinary intimacy and irreversible sacrifice, and it has been performed more than once in Dragon Ball Z's story by beings who understood exactly what it cost and chose to pay it. Nail is the most prominent example of the sacrifice form, a warrior clan Namekian who had dedicated himself to protecting Guru, the Great Elder, the eldest and most powerful Namekian who had lived long enough to carry the entire history of the race within him. Nail's power was considerable. He was, at the time of Frieza's assault on Namek, among the strongest beings on that planet, trained to a level that placed him well above the ordinary Namekian warrior. He fought Frieza nonetheless, not with any expectation of winning, but to buy time, to give others the moments they needed to act. Frieza, who found the exercise pointless, eventually left him broken and breathing in the grass, which is where Piccolo found him. The fusion between Nail and Piccolo was not dramatic. It was necessary and it was accepted, and Nail's consciousness persisted within the combined being in a way the story acknowledged briefly. A voice in the back of a mind that had been expanded by the merger, a presence that remained even as it dissolved into something larger. Piccolo emerged from that fusion significantly stronger, changed in ways that went beyond power, carrying within him the resonance of a life devoted entirely to service and protection. Piccolo himself is the Namekian that Dragon Ball Z's audience knows most intimately, and the full arc of his story is one of the most complete character journeys in the series. He arrived as a villain carrying his father's hatred and his father's ambitions the reincarnation of the original Demon King Piccolo, born to complete what the previous Piccolo had started. The story that follows is the gradual, consistent, entirely earned transformation of that intention into something else, not by dramatic revelation or sudden change of heart, but through the accumulated weight of choices made over years, each one slightly more oriented toward the world's protection and slightly less toward its conquest. Gohan was the agent of that transformation, or at least the catalyst, the child placed in Piccolo's care who looked up at him without fear before there was any reasonable basis for that fearlessness, who called him mentor and mentat, who grew under Piccolo's instruction into the fighter he became with Piccolo's specific imprint on every technique. What Gohan gave Piccolo in return was something the series does not name directly, but shows consistently: a reason, a specific, concrete, present in the room reason to be the person he was becoming rather than the person he had been made to be. Guru, the great elder, the patriarch of the Namekian people at the time of Dragon Ball Z, carried within him the potential that the entire Namekian race held, accumulated over a lifetime of enormous length. His ability to draw out and unlock the latent power within those who came before him was among Dragon Ball Z's most significant power amplification moments, applied to both Gohan and Krillin in ways that immediately and substantially changed what they were capable of. He died during the events on Namek as a consequence of the grief he carried for his people, the loss of the Namekian villages, the deaths of his children, the destruction accumulating around him. His death reset the Dragon Balls of Namek, ending their power and the wishes still remaining. Even in dying, the Great Elder was part of the story's mechanics. Namek was destroyed, the planet that had always existed in that deep and saturated green, that world of two suns and quiet water and a people who had built something gentle and significant there, was consumed in the explosion that followed Frieza's detonation of its core. And the Namekians, who had survived Frieza's assault through the sacrifice of several of their number and the intervention of the Dragon Balls, were transported to Earth and lived there briefly before the Dragon Balls produced a new Namek for them, a world that bore the name and the intention of the old one, built fresh in the space between stars. That resilience, that capacity to lose a world and begin again, is the most essentially Namekian quality of all. Not the power, which is real, not the Dragon Ball creation, which is extraordinary, but the willingness to carry what was lost forward into something new, without bitterness, without despair, with the quiet intention of a people who understand that what matters is not the place, but the continuation. If there is a race that the story of Dragon Ball Z chose as its center of gravity, it is the Saiyans, not because they are necessarily the most powerful beings in existence at any given moment. The series is careful to be honest about that, to produce beings and transformations and divine hierarchies that the Saiyans must work toward and reach for, but because the story chose a Saiyan child as its first lens, and it has never entirely stopped looking through that lens, even when everything around it expanded into the divine. Planet Vegeta was their world. Not always. The Tuffles had it before them, and that history is real and significant, but in the era that Dragon Ball Z describes, it was their world in every sense. They had claimed it, they had named it, they had organized their entire civilization around the specific logic of power and battle that was, to the Saiyans, not a value system so much as a fact of nature. You were powerful or you were not. You were elite or you were sent to the margins. You contributed to the Saiyan project of conquest and supremacy, or you had no place in the hierarchy that the project produced. Saiyan infants were assessed at the earliest possible moment. Their battle powers were measured with Tuffle-derived technology, a particular irony that the series does not dwell on but that is present in the record, and that measurement determined the arc of the life that followed. Low-class warriors were assigned to weaker planets, sent to clear them for galactic sale in the service of Frieza's empire. Mid-class warriors trained and fought and moved up through ranks that were real but had ceilings for most of them. The elite trained alongside the royal line, representing the aspirational peak of what Saiyan society believed itself to be building toward. Goku was born Kakarot, a low-class warrior. His battle power at birth was modest in Saiyan terms, the assessment of a child whose potential was not obvious at the measurement. He was assigned to Earth accordingly, a planet of weak beings, a simple clearing job, a task designed to require almost nothing from someone whose contribution the Saiyan hierarchy did not particularly value. What happened instead was everything that Dragon Ball is. The ship carrying him reached Earth. He sustained a head injury that erased whatever conditioning and purpose had been programmed into him. A kind man named Gohan found him and raised him as a grandson, and the child who had been sent to conquer a world grew up protecting it instead, with the specific and earnest love of someone who had been raised to believe that people were worth caring about. That inversion, the weapon becoming the shield, the conqueror becoming the protector, the low-class warrior becoming the universe's most important fighter through a combination of extraordinary potential and extraordinary character, is the central fact of Dragon Ball Z's story. Everything else orbits it. The Zenkai is the mechanism that the series uses to explain Saiyan power escalation in its early arcs, and it is worth understanding clearly. When a Saiyan survives a near-death battle, when they are brought to the edge of what their body can endure and recover from it, they emerge from the recovery stronger than they were before. Not simply healed, but genuinely improved, the body recalibrating its own capabilities in response to the evidence of insufficiency. This is not a metaphor in Dragon Ball Z. It is a biological fact of Saiyan life, observed and counted on by both the Saiyans themselves and their opponents. And it means that the correct response to injuring a Saiyan, without killing them, is to regard the outcome as a defeat, not a victory. The great ape, the Uzaru, is older than Super Saiyan by the entire length of Saiyan history. It is the form that every Saiyan born with a tail can achieve under the right conditions, the absorption of enough Blutz waves from a full moon, or from an artificial moon produced by the right technique, triggers a biological transformation that increases the user's size to enormous scale and their power by a factor of 10. The Uzaru is not subtle, it is not elegant. It is a massive and largely instinct-driven expression of amplified physical force, and in the early stages of Dragon Ball Z it was among the most dangerous forms in the story, before the transformations that came after it pushed it out of the conversation. The legend of the Super Saiyan is one of Dragon Ball Z's most carefully constructed mythologies. It was spoken of before it was seen, a warrior of extraordinary power, arising once in 1,000 years, golden-haired and beyond what the current age could produce, a figure of prophecy rather than a current fact. The gap between the legend and the reality gave the transformation a weight that it might not have had if it had simply appeared as a training achievement. It arrived as the fulfillment of something that had been promised, something that the Saiyans had told themselves about who they were and what they were capable of becoming. When Goku achieved Super Saiyan on Namek, standing above Krillin's death, releasing in grief and rage everything he had been holding at his human baseline, his hair going gold and his eyes going teal, and the air around him responding to the change as though the world itself needed a moment to process what had just happened. It was earned. Not in the sense that he had simply trained hard enough, though he had trained extraordinarily hard, but in the sense that the moment was emotionally true, that the transformation expressed something real about the character and the story and the relationship that had just been ended by a villain who had no conception of what the people around him meant to each other. Vegeta's path to Super Saiyan was different in texture and in cost. He was a prince. He had always been told, and had always believed with a conviction that went all the way down to whatever was beneath ambition, that he was the best, the strongest, the one to whom the universe's power hierarchy was ultimately oriented. And Goku, a low-class warrior, a child dismissed by everyone, including Vegeta himself as recently as a short time ago, had achieved something that Vegeta had not. That gap was unbearable to him in a way that is very human and very specific. The particular pain of someone whose identity is constructed entirely around being the best, discovering that the best, at this moment, is someone else. He trained. He pushed past limits that his body told him were final. He forced the transformation through sheer refusal to accept the alternative. And when it came, it was cold and precise in the way that most things Vegeta does are cold and precise, stripped of the warm emotional catalyst that had triggered Goku's. Both transformations were real. Both led to the same golden hair and the same increase in power. But they felt different, because they came from different places and expressed different things about the people who achieved them. Super Saiyan 2 arrived in Gohan, at the Cell Games, with electricity and a quality of stillness that the series uses to distinguish it from the rawness of Super Saiyan. It was sharper, more controlled. Paradoxically, even though the power driving it was larger, Gohan in Super Saiyan 2 was not wild, he was precise and deliberate, and genuinely frightening in a way that Super Saiyan alone had never quite achieved. Because Super Saiyan 2 carried within it the specific clarity of someone who has finally let themselves become what they always were. Super Saiyan 3 is Goku's furthest exploration of the traditional line, the form he achieves in his afterlife training between the Cell Games and the Buu arc, a transformation that drops his eyebrows and grows his hair past his waist and produces an outpouring of energy so overwhelming that the earth trembles and the sky acknowledges it. It is extraordinary. It is also in practical application, costly in ways that the series is honest about. The energy burn of Super Saiyan 3 is enormous, and sustaining it demands a price that limits its usefulness, even as it demonstrates the ceiling of where the form can go. The legendary Super Saiyan, Broly's form as Dragon Ball Super Broly reimagined and established it, is not on the same developmental line as Super Saiyan 2 or 3. It is a mutation, a once-in-every-1,000 years biological anomaly that produces a different kind of transformation. One that does not plateau in the way that ordinary transformations plateau, that keeps growing under pressure with no evident ceiling, driven by an internal energy surplus that has no other outlet and that the body simply does not know how to stop expressing. Watching Broly fight in the canonical Dragon Ball Super, Broly film is watching something that the story frames specifically as being of a different order. Not more powerful in the way that Super Saiyan 2 is more powerful than Super Saiyan, but genuinely different in kind. The Saiyans were nearly destroyed. Frieza, who had employed them as soldiers and who watched their potential with the attention of someone who understood power well enough to recognize a threat before it became one, destroyed planet Vegeta and almost everyone on it. Almost. A handful survived, scattered by chance or by assignment to distant missions. Goku survived because he was an infant on a ship headed for Earth. Vegeta survived because he was on a mission. Nappa and Raditz survived for similar reasons. The race that might have grown into the universe's greatest threat was reduced to a remnant, carrying a history that most of them knew only in fragments. From those fragments, Dragon Ball Z built its entire story. Every transformation, every battle, every moment of growth and loss and impossible survival, all of it rooted in the fact that a warrior race was almost extinguished, and that what remained of them carried the potential to become what they had been told they could become, in a universe that kept producing reasons to reach for it. There are moments in Dragon Ball Z when the story acknowledges, quietly and without much ceremony, that the universe it has been building contains things that its own logic cannot fully account for. The Majin are one of those acknowledgments, beings that predate the current structure of existence, that carry within them a power and a history that the story can gesture toward, but not entirely contain. Majin Buu is the character through whom the Dragon Ball Z audience encounters this race most directly, and the full account of what he is requires patience because he is not one thing, but several things across the course of his arc, each form reflecting a different configuration of the same fundamental strange existence. The original Buu, the form that emerged before any absorptions changed him, is described in the Dragon Ball Z materials as having been in existence for millions of years. He was discovered or summoned, or perhaps more accurately released, by BBD, the sorcerer who preceded Babidi, and in the era of the ancient Supreme Kais he was a figure of absolute destruction, erasing things with an ease that the gods of destruction themselves found significant enough to note. The Grand Supreme Kai, the most powerful of the Supreme Kais at the time, chose to sacrifice himself by allowing Buu to absorb him, a choice made not in defeat, but in strategy. The calculation that altering what Buu was from the inside would cost less than trying to destroy him from the outside. That absorption changed Buu fundamentally and permanently. The Grand Supreme Kai's consciousness merged into Buu's body, introduced something that had not been there before, a capacity for experience, for preference, for the kind of innocent and uncalculating joy that belongs to very young children who have not yet learned to treat delight as something that requires justification. The fat, pink, childlike Buu, who was sealed away by Bibidi and eventually released by Babidi, was the result of that merger. And the contrast between what he looked like and what he was capable of was one of Dragon Ball Z's most deliberately unsettling choices. Buu's biology is one of the series' most deliberately unusual constructions. His body is composed of a magical elastic material that regenerates from any damage, not quickly in the organic sense, but immediately and completely in a way that bypasses the concept of injury entirely. An attack that would destroy a biological fighter does not damage Buu's body in the same fundamental way. Individual pieces of him that are separated from the main body can be called back, reabsorbed, recombined. He cannot be killed by conventional means. Every fighter who faced him in Dragon Ball Z had to contend with the specific psychological weight of that fact, that no matter how much damage was done, the pink material floating in the aftermath would simply find itself again. Super Buu is the form produced when the childlike quality that had been part of Buu since the Grand Supreme Kai absorption was separated from him, leaving behind something leaner and colder, and considerably more purposeful. Super Buu's intellectual engagement with combat was more complete than the Fat Buu's had been. He could plan, deceive, adapt in real time, and, most damagingly, absorb. His absorptions of Gotenks, of Piccolo, and most significantly of Gohan produced forms that the story had to use all of its available resources to counter. Super Buu with Goten's power was at that moment in the story the most powerful being in the Dragon Ball Z universe's mortal and semi-divine categories, carrying within him the strength that had defeated Cell and the tactical intelligence of Piccolo and the raw energy of Gotenks. Kid Buu, the final and most honest form, the original before any absorptions, is what remains when everything that was added has been removed. He is small and quick and empty in the specific way that pure destruction is empty. No ego to negotiate with, no ambition to redirect, no desire that could be satisfied in any other way than the elimination of things. He destroyed planets in Dragon Ball Z, not with any strategy in mind, but simply because the energy had to go somewhere, and destroying a planet was as good a direction as any other. Goku's description of him as the most dangerous form echoes the Supreme Kai's assessment, not because his power exceeded Super Buu's in every dimension, but because there was nothing else there, nothing to appeal to, nothing to reach. The resolution of the Buu arc is one of Dragon Ball Z's most emotionally generous endings. The pure evil separated from the Fat Buu and destroyed, the Fat Buu, carrying the influence of the Grand Supreme Kai, capable of happiness, capable of wanting to bake cookies and watch television and live in the world rather than unmake it, survived. He is Mr. Buu, living on Earth with Mr. Satan, existing in a form that the series treats with genuine warmth in the extended story that follows. That an entity of incomprehensible destruction found its way to a life of quiet, ordinary pleasures is perhaps the kindest thing that Dragon Ball Z ever imagined. There is a quality to Frieza's presence in the scenes that contain him that deserves attention before any discussion of his power begins. He moves slowly, he speaks at his own pace, without apparent awareness that anyone else's sense of urgency should matter. He does not raise his voice, because raising your voice is what you do when you need to emphasize something, and Frieza has no experience of needing to emphasize anything. The universe has organized itself around him for long enough that his expectations have simply become his experience. His race, referred to by various names across different sources, the changelings being one commonly used designation, though no single term is entirely canonical in the English releases, is defined in structure by transformation, and that structure is inverted from most of Dragon Ball Z's other transformative races in a way that changes everything about how the power is understood. For the Saiyans, transformation is the release of a greater state achieved through training and emotional pressure. Super Saiyan is the ceiling pushed upward, the achievement of something beyond the baseline. For Frieza's race, the transformations work in the opposite direction. The suppressed forms are not weaker versions of a baseline, but actively restrained versions of a power that the baseline body genuinely cannot contain without those restraints. The transformations that move through Frieza's four forms are not achievements. They are releases. Each one removes another layer of control. Frieza's first form is the one he uses almost exclusively in most of his scenes on Namek. It is small and almost elegant, a compact shape that seems, at a glance, deliberately designed to be underestimated, to invite the assumption that power is measured by physical scale. The gap between this assumption and the reality is enormous even in the first form. His second form is larger and more obviously powerful, the presence of genuine force more legible in the physical size. His third form is monstrous, elongated and biomechanical, a shape that seems designed for intimidation as much as combat. The aesthetics of threat made physical. His fourth form, the final form, is smooth and white and still, and paradoxically less physically imposing than the third, and that paradox is the most important thing about it. The final form is what Frieza is when he has nothing left to restrain. It requires no performance. It simply is. The final form's power in Dragon Ball Z's Frieza saga was a recalibration of everything that had come before in the series. Frieza at 100% of his capability was a level that even the newly transformed Super Saiyan Goku engaged with careful respect, testing and measuring before committing to strategies. The battle between them on Namek, with the planet itself literally counting down its remaining minutes of existence in the background, is one of Dragon Ball Z's most cinematically accomplished sequences. The scale of the power, the intimacy of the combat, the mythological weight of what each fighter represented, the legendary warrior against the Emperor who had tried to prevent that legend from ever existing. What Frieza revealed about himself through that battle and through his eventual defeat was something that power alone cannot account for. The limits of pure ability when it is not accompanied by the capacity for growth. He was powerful. He was, at that moment in Dragon Ball Z's story, among the most powerful beings in the universe. But he had never needed to grow, and the absence of that practice left him, at a critical moment, less than what his raw numbers suggested he should be. His return in Resurrection F and in the Dragon Ball Super arc that incorporated it represented the correction of that gap. Frieza trained. For the first time in his life, Frieza submitted to the process of deliberate improvement, spent 4 months in genuine physical and ki conditioning, and discovered what most beings in the Dragon Ball universe have always known, that the potential you have is not the same as the potential you have developed. Golden Frieza, the result of that training, was evidence of what had always been possible if he had chosen to pursue it. The tragedy, or the satisfaction depending on your position in relation to the story, is that he arrived at this understanding in service of revenge rather than growth for its own sake. King Cold, Frieza's father, is a presence in Dragon Ball Z's story more suggested than demonstrated. His appearance during the arc involving future Trunks established that the capacity for extraordinary power in this race is familial, passed through the lineage in consistent ways, expressed in the same quality of cold authority and enormous physical strength, regardless of the specific individual. He arrived at Earth expecting to be in command of the situation. He met Trunks, who had come from a future where the situation had already been resolved, and his expectations and the reality of that moment failed to reconcile. The Frieza race built an empire. That fact is worth holding for a moment. Not the battles or the destructions, which are numerous and well catalogued, but the civilization. They organized a significant portion of the known universe into a functioning structure of hierarchy and service and trade. however coercive the conditions of that structure were. They employed other races, including the Saiyans, as soldiers. They maintained order, after their own fashion, across worlds that had previously had no interaction with each other. The Empire's methods were brutal, the Empire's scope was real, and when it fell, not gradually but in a specific chain of defeats beginning on Namek, it left a universe-shaped gap that the story's later arcs spent considerable time filling. The Dragon Ball Z universe operates under a divine administration, a hierarchy of beings whose responsibility is not the accumulation of their own power, but the management and protection of the cosmos they were appointed to oversee. This hierarchy has many layers, and the Kais occupy one of its most significant: the creators, the overseers of the living worlds, the counterbalance to the destruction that their divine counterparts administer from their own positions in the structure. King Kai, the North Kai, the one who oversees the galaxy containing Earth, is the first member of this race that Goku encounters directly. He lives at the end of the Snake Way, on a planet so small that its gravity alone would kill a normal human being trying to walk on it, a feature of the environment that he incorporates into the training he offers to the worthy dead, who make the months-long journey to reach him. He is not what the word God typically suggests. He is warm, slightly self-deprecating about the limitations of his own power, possessed of a sense of humor that his divine responsibilities do not entirely eliminate. He teaches with humor because humor opens things that solemnity keeps closed. The Kaioken is his gift to Goku, a technique of extraordinary risk and extraordinary reward, a multiplier applied to the user's existing power at the cost of enormous physical stress, doubling, tripling, quadrupling the power output of a Saiyan already at a high baseline, produces results that most opponents are not prepared for. But the body pays for each multiplication and strain that accumulates faster than it can be healed during the course of a battle. Goku used the Kaioken at levels that the technique was not designed to sustain. That choice, in the fight against Vegeta and in the battle against Frieza, produced the results the situation required and costs that the body carried afterward. The Spirit Bomb is King Kai's other major contribution to the story, a technique of a very different philosophical character. It gathers energy not from the user's own reserves, but from all living things willing to contribute their life force to it, assembled into a single concentrated sphere of what the series understands as the universe's own generative power. Beings of pure evil, beings who do not share in that generative quality, cannot withstand its impact in the way that good-natured beings can absorb it without harm. The Spirit Bomb is therefore both a weapon and an argument, a physical expression of the idea that life collectively has a power that no single being, however individually powerful, can easily overcome. The Supreme Kais, the Kaioshin who oversee not just a quadrant but the underlying creative forces of the universe, carry a weight of authority that the ordinary quadrant Kais reflect in reduced form. There is in Dragon Ball Z a specific structural fact about them that the story uses carefully. A Supreme Kai's life is cosmically linked to the life of the god of destruction associated with their universe. If one dies, the other dies. This is not a coincidence or a sentiment, but a structural guarantee built into the universe's design. The forces of creation and destruction are balanced not just philosophically, but literally, biologically, in a link that ensures that neither can be eliminated without cost to the other. The Elder Supreme Kai, the old Kai who had been sealed inside the Z-Sword and was released by Gohan's accidental shattering of that ancient blade, is one of Dragon Ball Z's most unexpected gifts to the story's final arc. He is ancient to a degree that makes the other characters' ages feel recent, old enough to have lived through events that the current order of the universe has mostly forgotten. His power, in the ordinary sense of combat capability, is not the primary thing he has to offer. He is candid about the limits of his fighting ability and self-aware about how the story's escalation has moved past where he can directly contribute. What he has instead is the ability to draw out, through a lengthy and personally uncomfortable ritual, the latent potential that exists in a fighter who has not yet accessed it fully. The ritual requires hours of sustained focus and physical contact, which Goku volunteers Gohan for without entirely preparing Gohan for what the process involves. The result, however, is Mystic Gohan, not a transformation in the conventional golden hair sense, not a new form with visual markers and dramatic presentation, but simply Gohan operating at the actual level of what he is, without the self-imposed barriers and emotional restraints that had always kept most of it contained. The Elder Kai did not add anything. He removed what was in the way. That is its own kind of wisdom, the knowledge that the problem is not absence of capability, but presence of obstruction, and the patience to address obstruction directly rather than trying to add more of what is already there. There is a question implicit in the title that the Dragon Ball universe answers quietly and with care. What does destruction look like when it is not evil? When it is not malicious, not motivated by rage or revenge, or the desire to dominate, but simply functional, the necessary counterpart to the creation that the Kais provide, the clearing of space, the removal of what is old or overabundant or genuinely dangerous, in service of a universe that cannot grow without occasionally being reduced? Beerus, the god of destruction of universe, 7 is the answer the series chose, and the choice is instructive. He is not a villain, he is not the story's antagonist in any final or meaningful sense. Even in Dragon Ball Super's initial arc, when he functions narratively as the force that the story's heroes must eventually be able to exist alongside without being casually erased, he is simply what he is, an enormous, feline, occasionally petulant being of divine authority and cosmic power, whose job is destruction and who performs that job with the same matter-of-factness that any professional brings to work they have been doing for a very long time. His power at full expression is not something that Dragon Ball Super fully demonstrates. The series is careful to maintain the gap between Beerus and even the most developed forms that Goku and Vegeta achieve throughout its run. What is shown is enough to establish the scale. He destroys things without effort. He destroyed half a planet once as a warning. His energy output in casual gestures exceeds what the series' heroes produce at maximum exertion. And he does this without performing it, without building up to it, or charging it or announcing it. It simply happens, the way consequences happen in the presence of causes. What makes Beerus interesting beyond his power level is the personality that carries it. He values food, specifically and passionately. The Tournament of Power's entire origin in Dragon Ball Super involves a search for a specific flavor of pudding that Champa claims exists in his universe and that Beerus categorically denies. A culinary argument that escalated to the level of a multiversal tournament because gods have egos like everyone else and more capability to act on them. He sleeps for decades at a stretch when nothing requires his attention, an occupational luxury available to someone whose divine responsibilities are cyclical rather than continuous. He respects strength and the presence of a mortal who can challenge or even surprise him, which Goku manages in ways that gradually shift the dynamic from simple cosmic hierarchy to something more complicated and more interesting. Champa, his twin brother and the god of destruction of Universe 6, represents the variety available within the category. He is less restrained than Beerus, more immediately expressive in his frustrations, quicker to act on impulse in ways that someone with more discipline might choose not to. The rivalry between them, conducted in the petty and earnest way that sibling rivalries are conducted regardless of the power levels involved, is one of Dragon Ball Super's most human relationships, which makes it also one of its most charming. Two beings of divine authority arguing about whose universe produces better food is a reminder that the Dragon Ball universe has always been willing to be both enormous and intimate, both cosmically significant and deeply silly. Above the gods of destruction, above the authority that commands destruction across 12 universes, sit the angels. They are attendants, guides, teachers, the constant presences beside the most powerful beings in each universe's divine hierarchy. They are, by every measure the Dragon Ball universe makes available, more powerful than the gods they serve. This arrangement is not incidental. The angels' role as guides to the gods of destruction is structural to the universe's design. The most destructive forces are paired with the most powerful beings of stillness, wisdom, and precision. It is a cosmic check built into the machinery of existence, the acknowledgement that power of a certain magnitude requires guidance that it cannot provide for itself. Whis is the most extensively portrayed of the angels in Dragon Ball Super. Beerus's attendant, the Angel of Universe 7, the being whose relationship with Goku and Vegeta over the course of Dragon Ball Super's story constitutes one of the series' most interesting ongoing dynamics. He trains them. He observes their development with the patient attention of someone for whom the timescale of their improvement is not inconvenient because his own sense of time is calibrated differently. He offers observations about their fighting styles and their habits with a precision that suggests he sees things they cannot see about themselves, which is almost certainly true given the gap between where they are and where he is. His demonstrated capabilities in Dragon Ball Super are each extraordinary in their own way, and together they create a picture of a being operating at a level that the story's mortal heroes are not yet in the same conversation with. He reversed time, turned back the universe by several minutes when Frieza's destruction of the Earth had already happened, giving Goku the window to act that the outcome required. This is not a key technique. It is a manipulation of time's structure applied to a cosmic scale in what appeared to be a casual intervention. He can travel between universes without apparent effort or mechanism. He knocked Beerus unconscious with a single precise application of force to the back of the neck, in a moment that demonstrated both the extent of his capability and the specific dynamic of his relationship with the god he serves. Ultra instinct is the quality that the angel race possesses as its natural state, the ability to move, react, and respond without the delay of conscious decision, the body and the mind operating in perfect alignment with the present moment, rather than calculating their way toward it. This is the state that Goku spent most of Dragon Ball Super's Tournament of Power arc attempting to access, achieving it in fragments, and then more fully under extreme pressure, the process of reaching it visible as a genuine struggle requiring everything he had. For Whis, and for the angels generally, it is simply how they exist. There is no drama in reaching it, because there is no distance to close. It is them. The Grand Priest, the father and overseer of all angels, the highest divine authority below Zeno himself, is a presence in Dragon Ball Super, whose power the series chooses not to demonstrate fully. He organized the Tournament of Power. He oversees the 12 angels, serving the 12 universes. He carries himself with the specific stillness of someone whose capability is so complete that the question of demonstrating it has simply never arisen in a way that required an answer. What he is capable of remains, deliberately, one of the Dragon Ball universe's most carefully preserved unknowns, which is perhaps the most eloquent possible statement about the answer. The angels in their collective presence represent the principle of the Dragon Ball universe that runs through everything it has always valued, that the deepest strength is not expressed through force, but through mastery, that the most powerful beings are also the most still, that at a certain level of genuine capability, the question of having to prove anything simply disappears. At the very apex of the Dragon Ball universe's divine hierarchy, above the angels, above the Grand Priest, above every structure and arrangement and order that the series has produced, sits the Omni King. Zeno is small. This is the first thing, and it is worth holding for a moment before moving to anything else. In a universe that has organized its visual language of power around physical size, around the great ape's enormous scale, around Broly's muscle mass, around the dimensions of planetary-sized Dragon Balls and star-consuming energy attacks, the most powerful being in existence is child-sized, round-faced, dressed in simple robes, accompanied everywhere by two attendants who say nothing and carry nothing and stand with the quality of beings that have never had cause to doubt anything about their position. He is delighted by things that delight him and bored by things that bore him. And the difference between these two states is for the rest of the universe a matter of extraordinary consequence. He erased 6 universes before the main events of Dragon Ball Super's story. erased them casually, as a kind of housekeeping following a tournament that had ended badly. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration or a charge-up or a visible expenditure of effort. He simply decided that 6 universes would not continue, and they did not continue. The Tournament of Power conducted in Dragon Ball Super's climactic arc was entertainment for Zeno and his future counterpart, the second Zeno from the timeline that Goku had brought forward. The two of them watching the competition together with the focused attention of beings for whom almost nothing is interesting enough to sustain focus, and this at least is providing it. The stakes of the tournament, that losing universes would be erased, their populations and histories eliminated completely, were the conditions of Zeno's engagement with the event. He was not cruel in establishing those stakes. He was simply honest about what would happen if the contest did not go a certain way. Cruelty requires the capacity for empathy with the affected, and the scale of what Zeno is makes that particular capacity difficult to locate. Goku's friendship with Zeno is one of Dragon Ball Super's most tonally unusual ongoing threads. Goku approached him without fear, which Zeno found refreshing. He promised Goku a gift for introducing him to his future self. He addresses Goku with the genuine warmth of a being who has found, in this particular interaction, something that holds his interest. That the most powerful entity in the universe finds a Saiyan farmer's son from Earth genuinely enjoyable company is, in its own way, one of the Dragon Ball universe's most endearing facts. The attendants who stand at Zeno's sides belong to a chapter of the Dragon Ball universe that the series has not written out in full. They carry no names that have been revealed, perform no techniques that the story has shown, say nothing in the scenes they occupy, but their proximity to the Omni King speaks for itself in the logic of the universe. Two beings whose entire existence is organized around standing beside something that could erase everything. They are there not because Zeno requires protection from ordinary threats, but because the universe requires that Zeno be accompanied by something, and what accompanies him must be commensurate with that proximity. What Zeno's race truly is remains one of the Dragon Ball universe's deepest and most deliberately preserved uncertainties. Whether there are others like him, whether he is singular or part of a kind of being that simply occupies a different relationship with existence than everything below it, is not something the series has answered directly. What exists is the fact of him, small and cheerful and capable of ending everything with a gesture, the ceiling above every ceiling, the limit past which the story does not go. At the end of the seeking, at the end of the searching and the finding and the gathering, at the moment when 7 spheres of orange crystal have been brought together in one place, and the sky above them darkens in acknowledgement, and the wind changes direction because something very old has been called, something rises, something vast and ancient and unmistakably alive, a being that has existed for as long as the Dragon Balls themselves have existed, which is to say, for as long as the Namekians who created them have been working their particular art, and perhaps longer in a way that the story suggests without fully explaining. Shenron is the dragon of Earth. He is green and enormous, his scales the color of old jade, his voice resonant in a way that occupies the air differently than human or Saiyan voices do. He is patient with the wishes brought before him, patient with the imprecision of how they are sometimes phrased, with the ambition that occasionally exceeds what he has the authority to grant, with the long human tradition of wanting things that require careful language to get exactly right. He will give what is within his power to give, and when it is not within his power, he will say so plainly, because Shenron does not perform limitations. He simply has them and acknowledges them. He has restored the dead, brought back warriors killed in battles whose outcomes would have been different without the Shenron option available. He has healed the injured and the broken. He has granted immortality to at least one being whose wishes went very badly for the worlds around him, Garlic Jr., whose immortality became part of the problem the story then had to solve rather than eliminate. He has said no when saying no was the only honest answer, and each time the sky darkened for him, he appeared, and each time he granted what was asked, or did not. And then he dissolved back into the Dragon Balls, and the Dragon Balls scattered and the sky returned to normal, and the world was slightly different from how it had been before. Porunga is the dragon of Namek, summoned by the Namekian Dragon Balls, created by the Namekian Dragon Clan tradition, larger than Shenron and with a different character and a different range. He grants 3 wishes, where Shenron grants 1. His design carries more weight and presence, a physicality that suits the more demanding requests he is equipped to address. He was crucial to the Namek saga. The 3 wishes he could grant were a strategic resource, around which entire chapters of planning and sacrifice were organized. The question of how to use those 3 wishes most effectively, giving the arc a specific kind of tension that worked on the story's tactical level, while the fighting was occurring at its physical level. Super Shenron operates on a scale that requires a different vocabulary to describe. The Super Dragon Balls, planet-sized spheres scattered across the space between universes 6 and 7, requiring extraordinary effort simply to locate all 7, are the creation of a divine tradition working at the highest registered level of what Dragon Ball's cosmic craftsmanship can produce. The dragon they summon is golden, and his scale is cosmic. In the moment of his full manifestation, his body stretches across distances measured in light years, and his voice when he speaks does not so much fill a space as constitute it. Any wish, no limitations. The god Zeno himself has been on the receiving end of a Super Shenron wish, an entire universe restored at the cost of a single properly structured request. The Shadow Dragons are Dragon Ball GT's reckoning with the cost that had always been present in the Dragon Ball universe's greatest power, the cost of the Dragon Balls themselves. Every wish, every resurrection, every reversal of outcomes that should have been permanent generated negative energy, a corruption that accumulated within the Dragon Balls over decades of use. The Shadow Dragons were born from that accumulation. 7 beings, 1 for each Dragon Ball, each one the embodied consequence of the specific wishes associated with their sphere. They were not created by anyone. They were produced by the universe's own response to having been asked for too much, too many times, by people who had not considered what the asking cost. Each Shadow Dragon carried the negative energy of its corresponding Dragon Ball's history and expressed it in its own way. Some were more immediately dangerous than others. Some had abilities that made direct confrontation inadvisable. And Omega Shenron, the final Shadow Dragon formed from the 1-star Dragon Ball that had absorbed the negative energy of all 7 spheres when he collected them, was among the most dangerous opponents Dragon Ball GT ever produced. His ability to absorb the powers of the other Shadow Dragons made him an escalating and adaptive threat, each additional power changing what he could do and requiring a response that his previous configuration had not prepared for. The degree of power required to finally address him, a spirit bomb assembled from the entire Earth's willing contribution, and beyond even that, placed him at the outer edge of what the Dragon Ball GT universe could produce. The dragons, as a race, occupy a unique position in Dragon Ball's mythology. They are not fighters in the conventional sense. They do not have battle power rankings or transformation sequences. They exist as manifestations of something the universe built into itself deliberately, a mechanism for the correction of permanent outcomes, a way of holding open the door that death and destruction close, an acknowledgement that some losses are too significant to be irreversible. They are the universe's answer to grief, expressed in the form of enormous ancient creatures, rising from orange crystal and speaking in voices that occupy the air differently than anything else alive. There is a thing that happens when you hold all of these races in mind at the same time. All of them, from the Saibamen growing in the Saiyans' hands to the Omni King sitting at the apex of a divine hierarchy that stretches further up than most of its own members can see. The thing that happens is a feeling of scale, of a universe so genuinely large and genuinely varied that no single perspective can hold all of it at once, that every lens you look through necessarily leaves something outside the frame. The Dragon Ball Z universe was never simply a story about fighting. Fighting was the language it used, the most consistent visible expression of everything it was actually about growth and loss and the way that people carry each other through difficult things. and the specific kind of love that shows up not in tender moments, but in the willingness to be broken for someone else's survival. Every race in the story contributed something to that larger conversation, even the ones whose contribution was primarily to provide the pressure that the story's heroes needed in order to become what they needed to become. The Saibamen reminded the story that danger does not announce its size. The Namekians demonstrated that creation is not weaker than destruction, only quieter. The Saiyans showed that inheritance is not destiny, that the race that was nearly extinguished because of its potential became, in its survivors, the unlikely heart of a universe that it had originally been designed to conquer. The angels hold the still point of the turning world, present at the top of every hierarchy, the reminder that the deepest strength has always been associated with the deepest calm. And through all of it, through every saga and every transformation and every terrible loss and every impossible survival, the story kept returning to the same place, a blue-green planet at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, worth every battle that had ever been fought for them, worth every price that had ever been paid. The Earthlings, in the end, were the point, not because they were the strongest, but because the universe the story built was always at its foundation a universe in which they mattered. That is the Dragon Ball universe, at its quietest and its most essential, a place where every race, in its own way and on its own terms, was part of an argument for the value of life, of all life, in all of its strange and extraordinary and sometimes heartbreaking forms. Rest in that, tonight. The universe is very large and very old, and it has been here for a long time, and it will be here when you wake up. Everything in it will still be where you left it. The Saiyans will still be golden in the memory. The Namekians will still be green against the blue. The angels will still be still, and Shenron will be waiting to be called, and somewhere at the top of everything, something very small and very powerful will be watching, delighted by things it has not yet seen. You have seen them now, in your own way. You can close your eyes. Thanks for relaxing with these Dragon Ball stories. If you're still awake and want more, another video is waiting on your left. Let it play as you settle deeper into your pillow. Rest will come when it's ready.